Take a look at this map. It's a real map from CNN showing Utah as a likely swing state in the 2016 election. If you know anything about Utah, this is absolutely insane. For decades, Utah has been one of the reddest states in the union. That is, they vote conservative Republican almost every presidential election. So what was different in 2016 is that on the ballot was a man named Donald Trump. And the Latter-day Saints, who are a big component of the voter bloc in Utah, did not like him. And you can clearly see the Latter-day Saint dislike for Donald Trump in the 2016 Republican primary election in Utah. That election resulted in Ted Cruz destroying Donald Trump.
Now to Utah and the campaign. Ted Cruz scoring an overwhelming victory in that state, winning all 40 delegates. Cruz picked up nearly 70% of the vote.
There were only 25,000 people in the entire state of Utah that voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 primary. Now, of course, Donald Trump would go on to win the Republican nomination, but that didn't stop the media from wondering what Utah was going to do in that election year.
There's a recent poll come out of Utah where the Mormon community is uniquely averse to voting for Donald Trump.
You see, the talk was that Donald Trump just didn't have the same ethics or morals that the Latter-day Saints like to vote for.
Trump's morals don't match Mormon morals.
He brings conservative beliefs, but those beliefs and the way that he expresses them clash with a lot of personal morals for members of the church.
So despite him being a Republican, people were wondering if they were possibly going to give their vote to some other party. And this was further evidenced by big-time politicians that are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For example, Mitt Romney was a huge outspoken critic of Donald Trump and the new Republican Party. He definitely seemed to be a voice of the Latter-day Saint thinking at the time.
If we Republicans choose Donald Trump as our nominee, the prospects for a safe and prosperous future are greatly diminished.
Fast forward just a little bit more, and you run into a new Latter-day Saint who says he's going to be running for president against Donald Trump in order to restore true conservative values.
There has to be another way forward, and that is, I believe, a new conservative movement that will bring in more people into the fold.
His name was Evan McMullin, and prior to him stepping into the race, the thought was that Donald Trump might likely win the state. But once Evan McMullin comes into the picture, everything changed.
Some polls have shown Evan McMullin is at least competitive, maybe can win. Mike Pence going to Utah saying to Republicans and conservatives, please don't do it. A lot of conservatives do want to make a statement. A lot of conservatives are not happy with their nominee, Donald Trump.
You see, CNN in their prediction is listing Utah as yellow, meaning they're not going to vote Democrat or Republican. They might vote for this new guy named Evan McMullin.
At the moment, there's a third-party candidate, Evan McMullin, who a lot of people think has a good chance to win Utah.
Now, let's just point something out here that I think is worth noting. You see, Utah doesn't represent the Latter-day Saints, and the Latter-day Saints don't represent Utah. They're not the same. People inside of Utah can get annoyed with this because they're like, yeah, we're not all Latter-day Saints. And people outside of Utah who are Latter-day Saints get annoyed with this idea that Utah is a representation of everything that Latter-day Saints are. So while we'll talk about Utah, most of the Latter-day Saints actually followed this same pattern that we're about to see. And that pattern is represented almost perfectly by one of the most outspoken political commentators that is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Glenn Beck.
We need a constitutional restraint on the executive branch. And Donald Trump, I really truly believe, is a very dangerous man.
Glenn Beck was so against Trump. I remember him saying at the time that if Trump wins the election, you would be willing to give away your arm to go back to Barack Obama. And if you know anything about Glenn Beck, this is a crazy statement because he thinks Barack Obama was one of the worst presidents in the history of the country.
To vote for Hillary. It has crossed my mind.
So when it was time for the general election, nobody knew for sure what Utah was going to do. And yet, Donald Trump ended up winning the state. Though, not by as much as you might think. He only won about 45% of the vote, which is less than a majority. Evan McMullin, while he performed well in Utah, failed to do well in the rest of the country. So then what happened after the election started to soften the hearts, perhaps, of the Latter-day Saints. First, Donald Trump invited the Tabernacle Choir to sing at his inauguration. This is something that Republicans have traditionally done, and it was a nice gesture on behalf of the new president. But things didn't stop there. He also had a visit with President Nelson in the first presidency to learn about the Bishop's Storehouse, where he got to sit down and talk with the first presidency of the church. And he was very charismatic and complimentary.
Formerly a great heart surgeon, one of the best in the world. And he decided to help even more people by doing what you're doing. So we appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
But besides all of that, some of the policies that President Trump implemented actually were quite positive towards what Latter-day Saints tend to care about.
Moved the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Today, Donald Trump became the first one as president to say he is going to do it.
Today, we finally acknowledge the obvious, that Jerusalem is Israel's capital.
But one of the biggest things that made the Latter-day Saints start to like Trump was actually the judges that he put on the Supreme Court.
And unyielding loyalty to the Constitution, Judge Amy Coney Barrett.
In that area, a lot of members of the church would say, yeah, we don't like how Trump does X, Y, and Z, but you know what he did do great was put some good conservative judges onto the Supreme Court. You see, the conservative judges were there to try and stabilize and defend the Constitution, something that Latter-day Saints deemed to be an inspired document according to the Doctrine and Covenants. While the Latter-day Saints weren't eager to get Trump into office, what he did in office ultimately seemed to warm them up to him. In fact, let's go back to our friend Glenn Beck, the political commentator. Having been one of the most outspoken critics of Donald Trump, now if you look at Glenn Beck, you'll see that he is one of the biggest promoters of Donald Trump.
This is to me, a sacred duty and honor, not to just be here, but also to vote. We need to get people out to vote for Donald Trump.
He was won over by Trump's presidency, and he wasn't the only Latter-day Saint to be won over, because in 2020, the Latter-day Saints overwhelmingly would support Donald Trump, including in the state of Utah, where he would win the state again, but increase his margin.
Across the nation, 67% of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints voted Republican, but only 56% like how President Trump is doing in office.
I hypothesize that the Latter-day Saints will continue to vote conservatively. I mean, think of it. If they ended up voting for Donald Trump and he was able to win them over, there's almost no chance that they wouldn't vote for any other Republican that comes up in the future. Now, Donald Trump is a very controversial figure, almost as controversial as the phrase about gender in the Family Proclamation to the world. But to learn more about what that statement in the Family Proclamation means, you're gonna have to check out the next video.